Hello and welcome to Drydock episode 75. There's no channel admin for this particular video because I'm spending the preceding week to this video's release on holiday in, well, to be perfectly honest, cold and wet but very quiet Wales. And so I'm not going to have the time to record this on a Friday as I usually do. So yeah, now you're getting the recording now, but week in the past, I don't know what's going to happen a week in the future. Who knows, we might even have hit 100k, in which case I'll have to do an emergency video when I get back. But anyway, greetings people of the future, tell me of your strange and mysterious ways, whilst I shall tell you of the strange and mysterious past that is covered by the Patreon Q&A session. So let's get going. Class A Cornate asks, what if the Japanese threw the baby out with the bathwater and converted the Issei and Fuso class battleships into carriers? How would they have fared? Would the extra need for pilots have improved the speed of the Japanese training program? Would these 4 extra carrier hulls have resulted in the 1920s Japanese Navy being dogpiled by the US and Royal Navy, Marine Nationale, etc., due to the massive Washington Naval Treaty breach? To be honest, I think they probably would have been more rolling on the floor laughing and pointing the finger if the Japanese had gone with the 1920s carrier conversion for the Fuso and Issei class, because they would have been hilariously inefficient, as well as taken Japan's actual battle line down to 2. That being the Nagatos. The Congos obviously not being seen as full-on battle line units, at which point pretty much everyone who was ever worried about facing off against Japan would have just rubbed their hands together and gone, right, well, that's one problem solved then. And the reason I say that is because, yes, they are long ships for battleships, but if you look at Kaga, Kaga was brought in as a second choice after Amagi's hull was damaged in an earthquake. Kaga was shorter and smaller than Akagi, it was slower, and it was not as efficient. Now, that's basically on the hull of a Tosa-class battleship. The Tosa-class were, well, depending on whether you're talking about the Fuso or the Issei classes, the Tosas were about 1.5 to 2 knots faster than the Isseis and 4 to 5 knots faster than the Fusos. And even then, they got a carrier which the Japanese considered barely capable of appropriate speed. And the Tosas are also about 100 feet longer than the Fusos and the Isseis. So you would have ended up with a short carrier, a short, slow carrier. They're not tremendously larger than ships such as HMS Eagle and the French carrier Bern. So yeah, what you would have ended up with is probably 4 very slow, relatively inadequate carriers that maybe have an air group of about 30 aircraft apiece, which, given the carrying capacity of the other carriers, you basically sacrifice 4 capital ships for the carrying capacity of maybe 1.5 decent conversions, if that. So, yeah, I think everyone would have probably just giggled about it for a while, and the fact these hulls are well over 10,000 tons would have hurt the Japanese in the long term, because they would have been counted as carriers no matter how terrible, which would have meant that then when it came to building ships like the Shikaku class and Hiryu and Soryu, they would have said, no, you can't, you've used up all your displacement already, have fun with that. Well, the winners, I guess, would have been the Americans, because yeah, Pearl Harbor would not have been anywhere near as effective if these 4 had been trucking around with Akagi and Kaga instead of Shikaku, Zuikaku, Hiryu, and Soryu. Saitanga asks, I've read that in the Napoleonic era, certain administrations in Britain had opposed riders, i.e. doubling or cross-bracing, on old ships. As this would seem to extend the life of their existing and no doubt expensive ships, I'm a little confused about why this would have been opposed. Was there a material impact in ship performance if these modifications were made, or were these administrators perhaps interested in having new ships instead? So it's a combination of the two. There were a number of old ships that were on the verge of falling apart, and yes, the Admiralty really would rather have brand new warships, given that naval technology, albeit that it hadn't advanced anywhere near as fast as it would 100 years later, had advanced somewhat during the Napoleonic era. So the new frigates that were coming out were larger, stronger, faster, as were the ships of the line. So first rates had gone from sort of 100 to 110 gun ships up to 120 plus gun, etc. So yeah, they'd much rather have new ships than some old ships that were about to fall apart that they'd kind of been propped together. But also there was some significant concerns from a shipbuilding and performance perspective. One of which was that, well, the ships were already at a certain design standard displacement. So if you start sticking in dozens, if not hundreds of tons of extra wood, that's going to weigh the ships down considerably. So if, for example, you've got something with a relatively low main battery gun deck, like a first rate or second or third rate, you might end up having to rasé the ship into a large frigate just to keep the guns above the waterline, which is relatively important if you don't want to go the way of the Mary Rose, which of course reduces the utility of the ship anyway. So effectively you're getting a relatively expensive large heavy frigate instead of a ship of the line, because of all that extra displacement that adding all the extra wood would cause, and of course that will come with a performance impact as well. Plus, with a ship that's not designed for this kind of cross bracing from the start, there was also a certain amount of concern that the bits of the ship that you leave unbraced would then be subject to considerably more stress, because remember, the ships as designed originally, they would have moved to a certain degree with the ocean, which as a result of the forces acting on it, if you make certain portions of the ship much more rigid so that they no longer move or minimally move, then all that force is concentrated on the bits that are still moving, which could lead to failure of the ship, especially if it's in a state where you might want to brace it anyway in the first place because it's not in particularly good condition. So yeah, multiple reasons why a lot of these schemes were opposed. Douglas Peck asks, ignoring the fact that Russia would have little to no use for carriers and conversions would probably be far more expensive than they were worth, how expensive would a Gangut-Sevastopol class carrier conversion be, and how much of an odd duck would it be next to some of the other conversions of the time? Based on the costs for converting HMS Eagle and the costs for converting USS Lexington, I would put an approximate estimate that the cost of converting a Gangut to a carrier is probably going to sit somewhere in the £2 to £2.5 million mark, or its equivalent in rubles, whatever that happens to be in the 1910s. In terms of an odd duck, vary. I mean, size-wise, it's about the same size as Bern. Ironically enough, two questions on carrier conversion very close together, which gives you some idea of what its overall carriage capacity is likely to be, which is to say not very much. The Ganguts at least are a little bit faster to start off with, so if they lose the guns and much of the armour, they might be able to get up to something approaching a useful speed. So you might have ended up with something approximately resembling a Russian version of HMS Eagle, only slightly smaller and therefore not quite as good. And of course, you've got the fact that this would almost certainly be being done by the Soviet Union in an era where their maintenance budget for the Red Fleet was 2 bits of black bread and a bowl of stroganoff. So the chances of this being done cost efficiently or time efficiently are pretty much slim to none. They might even still be working on it by the time World War II rolls around, but even if they didn't, you'd end up with a set of relatively slow carriers, not really able to do all that much other than occasionally wander around the Baltic Sea and hope that the Germans don't show up. Although, given the luck of the Red Fleet, or rather any part of the Red Fleet that wasn't a submarine during World War II, there's every chance the Finns might have stolen one at some point during the war, which would have been quite amusing. His Lordship asks, in 1918 the Royal Navy was a monster in size. The 1939 Royal Navy was a fair bit smaller, but considerably more modern in many ship classes. Which version was objectively stronger? If they got into a shooting war through some kind of weird timey-wimey shenanigans, which Royal Navy would come out on top? Modernity or mass? This is going to be an example of where technology definitely takes the biscuit. Now, admittedly, a lot of the Royal Navy's capital ship fleet is pretty much the same as what the Royal Navy's top-end capital ship fleet was at the end of World War I. However, the changes that have occurred are quite significant. So, what would have been viewed as a top-of-the-line destroyer in 1919, in 1939, the Royal Navy viewed those as second-line destroyers and convoy escorts. Torpedoes have improved significantly in range and hitting power. Aircraft carriers are now a thing, and as much as you might want to sort of disregard or revile something like a swordfish or a skewer or a rock versus a camel, they are still going to be quite a bit more capable. And the 1919 Royal Navy doesn't really have much of an answer to that, considering that their anti-aircraft capabilities are basically a joke for 1939 era aircraft. Then you've got the fact that going beyond destroyers, obviously there are submarines on both sides, but once again, the submarines of 1939 are considerably more capable. You've got the cruisers, and the cruisers are the biggest thing because the latest and greatest cruisers of the 1919 Royal Navy, the C class, D, E class, and soon to be coming the Hawkins class, by 1939 in the Royal Navy, they're not even second-line cruisers. A few of them are being used as escorts for smaller formations, but by and large, most of them are being converted into other roles, such as anti-aircraft cruisers. So, yeah, trying to take a C-class cruiser with its single 6-inch guns and 1919 fire control up against a town class is just a recipe for disaster. And that extends even further up into capital ships, although the Royal Navy does have a lot more capital ships in 1918-19. Well, put it this way, in 1918 they don't have Hood yet. Hood launches a bit later on. Hood's fire control system, when it launches, is by far and away more advanced than anything else present in the fleet at the time. By the time of the Battle of Denmark Strait, when Hood goes up, its fire control system is amongst the oldest and least precise on the planet. And that is at least a contributory factor to her loss because of the lack of refits in between. Now, the Royal Navy of 1939 has a few pieces of early radar equipment. It has massively superior fire control in almost all of their ships, and to say even the oldest fire control unit they have, which will be, ironically enough, on the Hood, is still light years ahead of anything else present in the 1918-19 Royal Navy. So, short of a straight-up fleet battle, the 1939 Royal Navy has every advantage, especially when it comes to things like sonar and stuff for the fewer submarines that might still be around. And of course, without any aerial opposition, there's nothing really stopping the Royal Navy just collecting its carriers together and launching a massive Taranto-style strike on the 1918 Royal Navy. So yes, in all circumstances other than a close-range, brutal fleet action slugfest, in which case, obviously, the sheer mass of ships that the 1918 Royal Navy has will have a quality all of its own. Outside of that scenario, the 1939 Royal Navy would take that relatively easily. Rachel Ann asks, if World War I had been avoided and not exhausted Britain, what do you think would have happened with the Royal Navy in the 20s and 30s? Would Britain still have been interested in naval treaties? Would it have become so strong that Germany would have been forced to give up its naval ambitions? Could America have sought equality, or would its sheer size have intimidated Japan from its historical ambitions? Well, assuming that World War I doesn't happen, it puts everything in a rather interesting position, because the Germans had effectively given up the naval arms race roughly around, ironically enough, the time that World War I broke out. If you look at their building program compared to the British. So if World War I hadn't broken out, well, for one thing, the British would have finished all 8 of the R class, so that would have given them 12 15-inch gun battleships by the mid-1910s. Now, compare that with everyone else. To say Germany had basically decided to give up on the naval arms race, so they would have plateaued out their fleet, and they probably would have built at the rate of maybe 2 ships a year, maybe 2 battleships, 2 battlecruisers, or 2 and 1 going forward, which the British could easily have outbuilt, even slowing down their rate of construction. There would have been a big purge towards the end of the 1920s anyway, because by the time you've got fleets rocking around with considerable numbers of ships with 13.5 to 15-inch guns, and possibly 16 or 18-inch guns by the time you hit the early 1920s, there's no real reason to keep the 12 inches around. So there would have been a fairly big scrappage scheme, I think, at that point. But they could have retained the numbers because, hey, everyone else would have been doing roughly the same thing. Could America have sought equality? Theoretically, the finance and the shipyard capability is kind of there, but without the massive cash infusion they get from World War I and without the drive that gives them, it's very unlikely that that would actually happen. I mean, even with World War I bubbling away in the background, Congress was still starving the Navy of funds until halfway through the 1910s. And this is why the US Navy was only building pairs of dreadnoughts at a time when the Germans were building them in classes of 4 and the British were starting to build them in classes of 5 to 8. And of course, as we've said before several times in various videos, the American Navy was basically starved of funds for destroyers and cruisers just to keep that battleship force under construction, and that's not even counting battle cruisers. So, whilst America could, in theory, have kind of taken up the reins from Germany in terms of trying to compete with Britain in a naval arms race, by that point it would have been starting from a position that's so far behind that it would basically be better for them to try and wait for the big scrapping of the late 1910s - early 1920s, when the sort of large numbers of the 12-inch and maybe even some of the early 13.5-inch ships would have left the field, which, assuming that they continue to crank out standards in their 2-ship classes, barring the New Mexicos, then although the gap would still be there, it would no longer be a completely ridiculously insurmountable gap. It would merely be a challenging gap. And as far as sheer size intimidating Japan from its historical ambitions, well, the Anglo-Japanese alliance would still be in place, at which point any Japanese territorial ambitions will probably take place coinciding with, or possibly even allied with, British intentions. So the Japanese might still have their ambitions, but the ones that they have, potentially they're going to have to coordinate with the British, and some of the ones that drove them into World War II they won't need, because even if they get into sort of a word-slinging match with America, which tries to blockade and cut them off, if they're not then also cut off from British trade, they've got a lot less to worry about. Emerald Leafeon asks, you have to make a navy to conquer the world in 1945. You can pull any ships for your fleet that have been or are under construction, up to 500,000 tons total for the fleet. What would your fleet look like? Would it be mostly carriers, etc., etc.? Apparently I'm starting with a small island in the middle of the Atlantic with unlimited resources. And now the main problem I've got with this is that a 500,000 ton total fleet means that my total fleet displacement is only 2/3 the displacement of the US Navy's Essex-class carrier fleet, let alone escorts. So yes, this gives me a little bit of a problem if I want to try and conquer the world. You might have to add a 0 or 2 onto the end of that to get anything like a fleet that can conquer the world in 1945. Nevertheless, if I've only got 500,000 tons to do so, what would I do? I would probably do something along the lines of the biggest carriers I can conceivably build, so something like Midways or Maltas, something along those lines, maybe even slightly larger than that, with the sole objective of cramming the smallest nuclear capable aircraft aboard, along with perhaps some anti-aircraft escorting cruisers and a few submarines that are rigged to do something really crazy, like a really large I-400 style submarine with nuclear tipped V1 or something like that, because with 500,000 tons basically showing up with small, fast, or hidden task forces that can just lob nukes at people's coastlines is probably about the only way for me to come out of this in any way ahead, albeit glowing. Christopher Dent asks, in the second half of World War II in the Pacific, after the first round of great carrier battles, rather than trying to restore the Kido Butai to its former glory, would the Japanese have been better served in putting their naval resources into coastal defense and anti-submarine assets, i.e. suicide boats, motor torpedo boats, mine layers, submarines, and kamikaze swarms, rather than capital units and air groups? Would this type of asymmetric-ish warfare have been effective against the US Navy's island hopping and submarine campaigns? Well, certainly chasing after trying to rebuild a capital ship fleet was a massive waste of resources. Quite what they should have done. I mean, having a lot more anti-submarine assets is definitely a good thing. Although, to be honest, by 1944 it's far too late. Because even those take at least a year to build in the best of yards and bring into service. But yeah, I mean, more anti-submarine assets would cause more casualties in the US submarine fleet and might allow some more supplies to get through to Japan, which might enable some other stuff to happen. The main problem that the Japanese have by that point is just the sheer size of the US Navy. Things like mine layers, submarines, motor torpedo boats, kamikazes, etc. They work relatively well in the kind of asymmetric warfare where you've got a choice of a navy made up of large ships or a very large navy made up of small ships. The problem is that at this point the US Navy is showing up with enough ships that even if you show up with a bunch of cheaply built motor torpedo boats, suicide boats, etc., the US Navy probably still outnumbers you, except now you're running around in a glorified motorboat and they're chasing after you with a Fletcher-class destroyer, which is probably going to win that fight. So, yeah, it's very difficult to see what the Japanese could have done that would have had any significant impact in stopping the US at that point navally. Yes, kind of mass torpedo boat, motor torpedo boat, suicide craft, etc., might have had some effect on the landings and such, but they tend not to fare too well where you have to cross vast tracts of open ocean to get to your targets, and the US carrier fleets and even the shore bombardment forces are still significantly far away from the Japanese islands that are being attacked, and that includes all the very specific holdings, that they would be noticed and shot at long before they got in range of the US ships. And the other problem is, by this point, radar is so common that even trying to do sort of very asymmetric night warfare attacks with small craft, which historically are about the best way to use them, even that is going to run into the fact there'll be so much radar and searchlights they'll probably get shot to pieces. About the only thing that I can think of that they could have done that might have had some kind of impact, major impact at least, would have been effectively massive improvements in command and control coordination. And specifically, that's because, if you recall when we've talked about engagements in the past, that generally anti-aircraft crews tended to have to stay under cover, both to protect them from incoming fire, but also to protect them from the blast of a ship's own main guns during a surface engagement. So, about the only thing that I can think of that would have allowed them to do any kind of significant damage to a US fleet, not even the US fleet, but just a US fleet, would have been to do something along the lines of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but specifically aim for a major US task force, something with a lot of battleships escorting them. Take out the Japanese surface fleet such as it is, except instead of using the carriers as a decoy force, you would have to massively improve the command and coordination between them, and basically have it so that the carriers are equipped with whatever fighter craft you can get your hands on to provide a combat air patrol for the surface fleet. Stick them right in close as you can, because basically, let's face it, you're not coming back from this anyway. Stick them as close as you can into the surface fleet so that there's some anti-aircraft commonality shared between them. And then when the surface fleet drives in for the big engagement, then shortly thereafter, sort of once the guns start firing, then your carriers start to just swarm off kamikazes and torpedo bombers, as many as you possibly can. And if you can pull off a real magic trick, maybe even get the Japanese army involved and coordinated as well. At that point, you stand a small chance of doing some significant damage to the US ships, because then they have a choice of, they either continue to engage your surface fleet with their main guns, at which point your torpedo bombers and kamikazes have an infinitely easier time of it, because the only opposition they'll be facing will be the enclosed 5-inch 38 mounts, so the massive amounts of 20 and 40mm fire won't be a factor. Or they get their anti-aircraft gun crews out, and then they have to stop firing with their main guns, which gives your surface fleet a chance to do some damage relatively unopposed. That's about the only scenario that I can think of where you could do some real proper damage to a US fleet, and even then that involves a truly stupendous amount of command and control coordination, which I don't think the Japanese are capable of. Matt Blom asks, why did the Germans sell a partially built heavy cruiser to the Soviets despite the obvious animosity that Hitler had toward the Russians, and the fact that the Kriegsmarine presumably needed every major surface unit they could build? Why did the Russians even want a cruiser that was part built? Well, the simple fact is the Soviets asked for her. The Soviets desperately needed to modernise their fleet, and yes, although both sides didn't trust each other as far as they could throw each other, at the end of the day, the Soviets wanted ships, the Germans had ships, and they originally asked for all the Hipper class that hadn't been completed yet. So that, at the time, in 1939, would have been Prinz Eugen, Seydlitz, and Lutzow, as long with a whole bunch of other naval tech. They're basically trying to jumpstart their navy. The Kriegsmarine, understandably, said no, but they did agree to sell them the Lutzow and a bunch of other stuff. And this was effectively because, well, October 1939, World War II has already started. The Germans kind of know that they're not likely to complete Lutzow before the war's over, so it's not much use to them. But they're able to sell it to the Russians for almost twice as much as it cost them to build. So at that point, it's like, well, sell them incomplete heavy cruiser we don't have any particular use for and won't be of any particular use to them for quite a few years, in exchange for twice the resources we put into actually making it this far. So it was a good deal for the Germans. So effectively it was a case of the Germans couldn't use the ship usefully, and they were going to get a bunch of money for it. They didn't think the Russians would manage to complete it in any kind of reasonable time. Meanwhile, Stalin wanted everything he could get on the basis that he thought the attack and a war between Germany and Russia would start on his terms. So obviously his intention was to try and get as many ships as complete as possible. And hey, well, if you buy a ship off the Germans can't use the ship. So it's all good to him. So effectively both sides thought they were getting a good deal. As it turned out, given the rather lackluster combat history of the ship once it was in Russian hands, I think the Germans actually got the better end of the deal with their 150 million Reichsmark price. Video Dude 26 asks, the nationalist Chinese Ning Hai class, do you think they deserve the category of light cruiser, or do you think they're more like destroyer leaders or similar? These ships are a bit of an odd one, really. They're laid down in 1931, but if you compare them to something like a Le Fantasque class French super destroyer, they only have one extra gun at the same caliber. They have fewer torpedo tubes. Now, granted, they have a slightly heavier anti-aircraft armament. That's not necessarily anything much to write home about. They're about the same displacement, and obviously the Le Fantastica, I think. Anyway, the French ones, they're able to motor along at about 15 knots more than the Ning Hais, and dimensionally as well. The French destroyers are actually larger physically, so it's very difficult to see on those grounds why you might call these a light cruiser. But there's two things to consider. One is that the Le Fantasticas or whatever, and their successors, the Mogadors, were quite often reclassified as light cruisers by various Allied powers, especially when you look at the Mogadors. They massively outgun, outspeed, and outdisplace the Ning Hais by a considerable margin. But I think when you're looking at it in total, the one thing that would make me push them into the light cruiser category as opposed to destroyer leader or whatever is their speed. They're limited to sort of about 22, 23 knots. And so there's no way that you could classify them as destroyer leaders at this point, because there's no way they're leading any kind of significant destroyers. Certainly not any great speed anyway. So yeah, that you on that ground alone, you could say they are very, very small light cruisers, albeit that there are a bunch of destroyers out there that actually outgun them, and in some cases outdisplace them. So Long John asks, if cruiser warfare was a flawed concept, how could the Deutschland-class Panzerschiff have been better? Honestly, of the options that were available to them, there's not a lot that is really a viable concept. They had ideas for slow, heavily armed ships, sort of coastal defense battleship style things, either armed with a single triple turret or in one case a couple of twin 15-inch turrets. But the simple fact of the matter is, if Germany gets involved in a war with anybody apart from maybe Russia, they're not going to act as any kind of deterrent. I mean, they'll deter someone like Finland or Sweden from coming after them, but Finland and Sweden were never going to come after Germany in the first place. Whereas if you go to war with, say, France or the UK, a couple of effectively seagoing monitors aren't going to stop anybody. So I think that's probably not a viable thing long term. I think of all the designs that were proposed at the time, then probably the one that would suit them the best would have been the design that looks kind of like what they eventually ended up with, but has 4 twin 8-inch or 8.1-inch turrets, or is it 8.2, something like that. But basically, near enough as makes no difference, 4 twin 8-inch turrets in what is remarkably close to a conventional heavy cruiser layout. Now, whilst that wouldn't have really moved them beyond being heavy cruisers, it would have given them 3 conventional heavy cruisers, which then would have dovetailed nicely in with the Hippers later on, and would have given Germany a relatively comprehensive heavy cruiser force that would have been in that nice sweet spot of seaworthy enough, etc., to be taken out to sea for commerce raiding, cruiser operations, escort, etc., but not so large dash important enough that they were effectively held around as small capital units the way that they, after a few merchant raids, the Deutschland class historically were. So I think just building them as conventional heavy cruisers, they probably would have gotten the most utility out of them. Dan Jamieson asks, before the advent of gunpowder, how effective was ship-to-ship artillery? So artillery before gunpowder was a little bit hit and miss. I mean, the thing is, you can mount things like ballista or onagers and other kinds of catapults on a ship, sure, but you face two problems. One is the ballista might be good at taking out people, but a ballista is not especially going to compromise the fighting abilities of a ship. I mean, at worst, you've stuck a harpoon in its side. Oh, good for you. About the best you could probably hope with the ballista would be some kind of massive broadhead bolt that maybe rips up a sail or something, but it's not tremendously practical except in small galley warfare where you might be able to take out a bunch of the crew. Whereas with something like an onager or similar other stone-throwing catapult, that kind of thing might actually do enough damage, especially to one of the smaller, earlier ships, to actually sink it or badly impair it. The problem is rate of fire and the amount of ammunition you have on board. The rate of fire is going to be fairly low. You're not going to be carrying that much ammunition, and the accuracy is going to be pretty abysmal at any significant range. At the kind of range where it's actually practical, that you might actually reliably hit the ship, you can probably just board the ship at that point. And so there wasn't a tremendous amount of it. It was more common in the Roman period, but it kind of died off a little bit. There were still sort of spear throwers and javelin throwers and dart throwers and such around, and they're recorded very much in the Mediterranean, where a lot of ships were still small enough and light enough to be threatened by those things. Now, flaming projectiles, whether that be flaming ballista bolts or fire pots, or if you're in the Byzantines, Greek fire, or whatever, those could be very effective and very dangerous to an enemy ship because one or two hits like that, and if they catch fire, they're in a lot of trouble. The problem is that means having fire aboard your own ship, and any self-respecting captain is going to do his absolute best to make sure you don't have fire on board the ship at any time, let alone in the middle of a combat zone. So, yeah, it varies in effectiveness, as I say. It's basically the artillery that was available pre-gunpowder was most useful when you're facing off against small, lightly built ships like Mediterranean galleys. Outside of that, the best quote-unquote artillery that you could hope to have in ship-to-ship would probably be mass ranks of bowmen or crossbowmen so that you could snipe off the enemy crew prior to a boarding action. Lord Hawthorne asks, assuming the weapon could be successfully launched, how effective do you think Highball, the naval version of Barnes-Wallace's bouncing bomb, could have been against Axis capital units? So, for those of you not aware, this gigantic golf ball-looking object was in fact the slightly downscaled version of the bouncing bomb used against the Möhne, Eder and Sorp dams in Germany by the dam busters. Whereas that was a cylinder, this, as you can see, was a sphere, and it was designed as a counterpart that would carry about 500 pounds of explosive to a enemy ship, and it would then sink, having sipped across the water, and explode. Now, in terms of effectiveness, well, you're talking about delivering effectively a relatively large aerial torpedo's worth of explosive to the underside of a ship, so that part would have been very effective, and in some of the tests they carried out, they actually found the bombs were also capable of just punching straight into the side of a ship, which would have been quite the interesting effect to deliver the equivalent of about 10 16-inch shells in explosive terms into the heart of a ship near the waterline. So effectiveness-wise, yeah, they could have been quite effective. Their main attraction over torpedoes was, one, obviously their greater speed means you don't have to offset your aim as much, and it gives the enemy much less chance to evade. At the same time, the distance you have to drop them at is a little bit closer than for a torpedo, but at the same time you can actually fly in faster and drop them whilst travelling faster than you can when you're dropping a torpedo, so there is that. So overall, probably slightly less hazardous than trying to drop an aerial torpedo, and they could be fitted to aircraft that were certainly a lot more capable of taking care of themselves, like, say, mosquitoes, as opposed to a swordfish. Now, where their main advantage would have come in, apart from the obvious seaborne attacks, would have been that because obviously they skip over the water, they would have skipped over any anti-torpedo nets, so they would have been very good at attacking ships in harbour. It's just a little bit unfortunate that some early manufacturing errors, which were quite avoidable, meant that one of the first major tests of the system went quite badly wrong. If someone had actually done their job properly and got those and not committed those initial errors in manufacture of the prototypes, then the bomb could potentially have been brought into service a lot earlier, which would have then meant their relatively effective use against various capital units. The main reason that they weren't used historically in combat was that by the time they were ready for use in the latter part of World War II, pretty much all the major targets that they'd wanted to use them against had already been sunk by other means. In some cases, ironically enough, by things like tallboy bombs, which Barnwell's Wallace had also helped to develop. Corvus asks, last week I was aboard the USS Iowa and took a below-decks tour that goes down to the boiler and engine room levels. As we were walking along Broadway, the Deck 3 centerline passageway that extends the length of the ship, they pointed out a brass plate on the bulkhead with a mark at about eye height which denoted waterline at standard displacement. I asked what good knowing this did anyone, since it seems a bit of a parody of the "you must be this high to avoid drowning" signs, but no one could tell me. Do you happen to know why this is? Off the top of my head, I'm afraid no. I couldn't give you a precise answer because I don't know either. It does seem a little bit of an odd thing. If anybody who's maybe served in the Navy before and has come across this internal waterline marking, who does know what it's for, please let us know in the comments. The only thing that immediately comes to mind would potentially be that I know there are some items that are not meant to be transported above the waterline in certain times. So for example, I'm guessing is you wouldn't want to be carrying explosives around the ship above the waterline, and there may be certain things you might not want to transport below the waterline either. So I'm going to hazard a guess at potentially something to do with telling people sort of what decks above and below which they should or shouldn't be transporting certain sensitive objects at certain times. But that is purely an informed guess on my part, and I would welcome anybody who knows a little bit better in the comments to chime in and let us know what the actual answer is, if there is any. Kent W. Feverly asks, who do you consider to be the best Royal Navy and US Navy admirals of World War II? Well, I know we talked about underrated admirals, overrated admirals, etc., but if you're going to pick the best of each navy, it's pretty much always going to come down to me for two individuals. Obviously, Admiral Cunningham, as shown here, pretty much about the best you could hope to get in a Royal Navy admiralship in World War II. And the other one, on the US Navy side of things, would be Admiral Spruance. You've got various admirals who are very capable and did very good jobs in their respective fields, but I think at the end of the day, Admiral Spruance probably stands head and shoulders above the rest of them. There's very, very little you can criticise him for, an awful lot you can praise him for, and also he holds the rather rare distinction of being a US 4-star admiral who actually got directly stuck into one of the battles he was directing, which is always a plus point in my book. The Hand of Ray asks, would the Royal Navy's older battle cruisers, such as the Lion and Tiger class, have been good candidates for conversion into aircraft carriers as opposed to being scrapped? I think it depends when this happens. For all the fact that they're battle cruisers and therefore they're relatively long and relatively fast, at the end of the day, when you look at the ships that were converted into carriers in the 1920s, they actually don't stack up too favourably. they're capable sort of high 20s of knots, so maybe they might have been able to push it up to 29, 30 knots with newer machinery and obviously the less weight because of armour and guns being taken off. But at the same time, the Courageous class that were converted were about 80 to 85 foot longer than the Lion and Tiger class battle cruisers. Even cargo was bigger by a substantial margin. Now, they are a bit longer than the battleship that would eventually become HMS Eagle, and obviously they're much superior to something like Argus. So, given that the Washington Treaty classed any carriers that had been built prior to the treaty as experimental and thus not counted towards tonnage, if instead of converting Almirante Cochrane and Argus into carriers, the Royal Navy had gone and converted Lion and Princess Royal into carriers, for example, they probably would have gotten a lot better service out of them because they would have had high-speed carriers with a bit more carrying capacity, maybe 40, 50 aircraft, going down to maybe 30 to 40 by the time you get to the 1930s. But they would have been capable of relatively high speed, and they certainly would have been more useful to the Royal Navy than Argus and Eagle were. But with that said, their displacement being obviously well over 10,000 tons means that by the time the Washington Treaty rolls around, the Courageous class being that much larger hulls are simply much better candidates for conversion going forward. And to be perfectly honest, the odds of persuading someone to successfully convert Lion and Princess Royal from battle cruiser to carrier immediately after the First World War are probably relatively slim, I would say. So, yeah, they would have been good candidates in that very, very narrow period if you could pull it off between 1919 and 1921, but after that, no, the other choices that Royal Navy made were better. Paul from Chicago asks, it seems the British oxygen-enriched torpedoes required specialised equipment on the ship to enrich the oxygen. This weighed tons and took up space. Ultimately, the British went in another direction. Was this wise, and did the Japanese have a similar mechanism and issues with the Type 93 Long Lance? So, yes, the Japanese did have similar oxygen-generating equipment aboard the ships that were equipped with Long Lance torpedoes, and yes, initially it did cause quite the number of problems, although since the Japanese had this more widespread and also had more time to work on the equipment between overhearing about its existence aboard British ships in the 1920s and deploying it widely to their own ships in the 1930s, they had more time to perfect the technology and make it work a little bit better. Now, in terms of the British going in another direction and whether or not that was wise, well, although the sort of detonation happy nature of the Long Lance is sometimes a little bit overstated, it was still a major factor in the loss or damage of a number of ships. So, in that respect, given how many British ships had near misses and non-penetrating hits and also penetrating hits in areas that potentially could have set off such a explosion, it was probably a good idea overall. The British also had oxygen generating equipment for partial oxygen fueling on the 21-inch torpedoes on their cruisers, but they switched that over to air before World War II, in part, I guess, because of those safety concerns. So yes, the whether or not it was a wise choice for safety reasons, probably a reasonable one. In terms of whether or not they could have used the additional range on their torpedoes, there's a few situations where they might have been able to use longer range on their torpedoes if they had them, but most of the ones that I can think of would have involved ships like destroyers and such, which weren't fitted with the partially oxygen-enriched torpedoes. So things like maybe a Castor and Ardent, if they'd had longer range torpedoes, if they'd had that sort of Long Lance equivalents, they might have been able to fire on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau earlier and at less risk to themselves, which A, might have allowed them to survive, and B, might, at a stretch, have allowed Glorious to survive, you never know. but they are kind of edge cases. So on balance, it was probably a reasonable idea to switch back to not having liquid oxygen or compressed oxygen fuel torpedoes scattered about everywhere, especially considering that outside of something like Nelson's underwater torpedo room, most British torpedo launchers were considerably more exposed than the more heavily protected Japanese ones, for all the good that that did a number of Japanese ships. John Lubbers asks, how did ships with obstructions directly forward or aft of the main turrets prevent their guns from blowing these things apart when firing their guns? Particularly aft-mounted aircraft catapults like on later US cruisers and battleships, but also when you have long sloping up bows of fast battleships and superstructure, etc., when you're talking about amidships mounted turrets. Was there a sort of interrupter gear that would prevent the guns from being fired below certain elevations, and were there cases of ships accidentally damaging themselves or their aircraft during firing? So yes, this gear came in a number of forms. In some ways, it was dictated by the capabilities of the gun, but in a lot of cases, there were various forms of interrupter circuits or mechanisms. Most of the time they worked, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they'd be physically limited to certain slewing angles, so you physically couldn't point the gun past a certain distance or below a certain level. So, for example, you can see here that this is a secondary mount, the 4.5-inch guns on a British warship having physical safety rails installed to prevent them from accidentally blowing the back out of the turret in front or behind it, as this did happen on one occasion, and occasional malfunctions of the mechanisms and gears that were designed to prevent this did happen in various ships at various times. So when that did happen, obviously some form of physical barrier that would prevent that from happening completely was put in place. But generally speaking, for the main turrets, this would take the form of, as I say, various mechanisms or circuits depending on the period. Obviously, mechanisms are earlier than the electrical circuit versions, but also in terms of things like just general markings and such. So if a turret slewed round too far and was capable of slewing round too far, there might be markings on the turret or on the rollers or somewhere visible that would tell the gun captain, actually, this is an area where you do not want to be firing. And it would be big enough and obvious enough for them to realise this. Plus, also, once you get into the period of dreadnoughts and that kind of vessel, the main guns are generally fired remotely from a central position rather than by the gun turret crew themselves, unless the ship's being badly shot up and they're into local control. And one would hope that the people in the fire control system would take a look around them before actually letting loose with the guns and would realise what was going on. So there are a variety of systems. Fortunately, they all seem to have worked when it came to main battery guns. So there isn't any record that I can find of a ship basically blowing itself in half by shooting itself with its own main battery weapons, although, as I said, the mechanisms did occasionally fail on some of the lighter secondary battery turrets. Coos Army 001, or 0001 actually, asks, given the photo at gives link, photo will be in the question, if given the opportunity to have a photo like this taken of you on any ship of your choosing from all of human history, what ship would it be on and which uniform would you choose to wear? Well, it is a very dramatic shot, and to achieve that kind of shot, you pretty much have to go with turreted ships, because if you're going to go with that on older ships like a broadside Age of Sail ship of the line, well, to take a photo like that relative to the guns, you're going to be in the water, which is a bit more embarrassing and not particularly not particularly eloquent. And the same with central battery stuff, and some of the earlier turret ships would just be a bit of a mess. So I would say if I could have my photo taken on a ship like that, any ship whatsoever, I would probably go with either the refit HMS Warspite or the refit HMS Renown. Both for the service record and for just the general appearance. I know some people don't like the Queen Anne's mentions. I rather do. So there. With a runner-up being HMS Rodney, because that would be quite funny. But in terms of what uniform I would choose to wear, if it's a full-on uniform, then I wouldn't choose to wear any, because I don't want to misrepresent myself as having been in a naval service that I haven't been in. Certainly not if it's a period appropriate one. The only thing I might consider would be if it, given the 3 ships I have named are World War II era, and in 2 cases World War One as well era Royal Navy warships. The only uniform I might consider wearing would maybe be a replica of my great uncle's Royal Navy uniform, albeit that with any service ribbons that he might have earned, obviously on the right-hand side, to signify that this is worn in his memory and not me pretending to be something that I'm not. The Hand of Ray asks, what if magically Yamato was equipped with barrel for barrel with a mixture of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon weapons instead of the 25mm the Japanese call anti-aircraft weaponry, and being extra nice, let's assume they're also equipped with all of the fancy radar and fire director systems that the US Navy or Royal Navy might have had at the time. Could Operation Tengo have succeeded? Well, it certainly would have made life a lot more difficult for the US Navy pilots who are attacking the Yamato. Not necessarily sure whether it would have saved the Yamato from the air attack. It certainly would have caused a lot more casualties. Maybe if all of the heavier guns were also replaced by twin 5-inch 38s with the radar Mark 37 fire control, then that might allow it to fight its way through and evade enough of the American aircraft that it might not take as many, if any, hits, which would all be I mean, yeah, in absolute remote theoretical possibility, it might have been able to make it to its approximate landing area. But as I've commented in a couple of other times when Operation Tengo has come up, the number of Allied battleships that would have been waiting for it with massive grins on their faces would have meant that Tengo, as a concept of let us get this Japanese battleship to run aground and form a unsinkable firebase from which to repel the Allied invasions goes, no, that wouldn't have worked, because the Allied battleships would have been queuing up for their turn. I suspect there probably would have been some Admiral or other on a cruiser or a destroyer just sort of gently motoring around at about 30,000 yards as the various Allied battleships queue up, and then it would have been a bit like if you're in the UK Post Office. It would have been, battleship number 1, please. Your 5 minutes starts now. Battleship number 2, please. No. USS New Jersey, wait your turn. Thank you. As everybody takes an opportunity to fling vast amounts of high explosive death at the Yamato, which I don't think is going to survive. Pietro Bugni asks, do you think that in the Battle of the North Cape there would have been a different outcome if Leading Stoker Larry Fursland hadn't been closed up in the port diesel compartment of Belfast, and if so, how? So, for those of you who are unaware of Larry Fursland and what he did, he was awarded a Distinguished Service Medal for his actions, and this was basically when Belfast fired its first full salvo. He was down monitoring one of the diesel generators, but the vibration and shock of the blast from the full salvo that was fired managed to knock both of the fuses for the circulating pumps to that generator offline, and it began to overheat. So he wasn't able to replace the fuses or override them. So what he did is he went further into the ship, found a fire pump, which was obviously running on very cold salt water, and without a tool, manually hooked that into the feed for the diesel generator, switched it on, and kept it running like that. So the diesel generator stayed cool and kept running, kept providing power, and thus the turrets kept working. Now, given that that probably happened with the first salvo of the engagement, it's interesting to speculate what might have happened if he hadn't been there, or if he hadn't done what he did and therefore Belfast guns went offline. Now, the interesting thing is that the critical hits to Scharnhorst, such as the ones that destroyed the radar and such like, were actually landed by HMS Norfolk, not by Belfast. So, in that respect, things don't change that much because, well, Scharnhorst would still get hit by Norfolk, it would still turn away, still run south. Or would it? Because one of the major things was that Belfast and Sheffield firing with reduced flash powder and Norfolk not doing so meant that the contrast between gun flashes was substantially larger, which led Scharnhorst to misidentify Norfolk as a battleship, which in part contributed to Scharnhorst's decision to turn away. Now, if Belfast fires one salvo and then is unable to fire any more, although it can still use its radar and such like, the fact is Sheffield's guns would be the only other ones firing. Now, if it's only Sheffield and Norfolk that are firing, and Sheffield is slightly further away, there's a small chance that Scharnhorst might either recognise Norfolk for what it is or not mistake it for a battleship and might press on. And if Scharnhorst presses into close range engagement, especially if Belfast guns still aren't working, then short of some very lucky torpedo salvos, Norfolk and Sheffield between them can't hope to win a close range gunfight with the Scharnhorst. So there is that possibility there as an interesting one, and it's probably certainly one of the various reasons that were on the Royal Navy's mind when they awarded Stoker Fursland his Distinguished Service Medal. Mike Roach asks, "Good day, Drac. What are your thoughts on salvaging the scuttled High Seas fleet for use in low background steel? Are there better alternatives?" So, again, for those of you who may not be aware what we're talking about, low background steel is steel that's been made prior to World War II, because post World War II, the detonation of nuclear weapons, both in combat and in various tests, has led to a slight increase in the overall background radiation level in the air, and given the large amounts of air that get pumped into and over steel while it's being made, this means that post-World War II, most forms of steel that are made, although there have been some advances more recently in manufacture, but generally speaking, most forms of steel that are made have a slight background radiation count, which makes them unsuitable for things like Geiger counters, which are obviously trying to measure ambient radiation, because obviously you end up with small concentrations of radiation in the body of the counter itself, which gives a false reading. Whereas if you use pre-war steel, then obviously it doesn't have this heightened background count and therefore can be used to more accurately measure radiation levels. Now, as far as using the High Seas Fleet for it, I don't think salvaging the whole lot for it is worthwhile. I mean, the amount of low background steel that's necessary is relatively low, so, I mean, sure, taking the odd little bit here and there is probably not but intrinsically wrong. I mean, they're not especially war graves, considering that the crew knew they were scuttling and therefore skedaddled away before they sank. So yeah, I'm not opposed to them using small sections of the ship, or if there's a wreck that's just falling apart anyway, then you might as well. But I don't think they should become a prime scavenging site and sort of be stripped bare just for the building more Geiger counters, etc. There's plenty of other pre-World War II wrecks, or well, pre-1945 wrecks around the British coast that could be picked up and used that have slightly less historical value, mostly thanks to the High Seas Fleet and Kriegsmarine U-boat arms. Cicero asks, what were some early attempts at fume extraction like? Do you think you could have pinned down the first fume extraction-abatement system attempted and the first fume extraction system that was successful? In broad terms, the idea of quote-unquote fume extraction had been known for quite a while aboard ships, and on Age of Sail ships there were various impellers and bellows and such that were man-powered that were used to pump air through the ships to prevent all sorts of diseases and moisture and condensation spreading. But obviously this was just for general airflow and not particularly useful in times of battle when A, those men would be needed, and B, the amount of smoke and fumes and hot air, etc., from firing so many broadside guns would have rapidly overwhelmed any such system's capabilities anyway, even assuming there was clear air outside for them to suck in, which there probably wouldn't have been. But in terms of the first mechanical ventilation fume extraction systems that would actually have worked to such a purpose, in 1840, the first steam-powered fans were installed on ships that were being sent on the Niger expedition, as pictured here, and that is probably about the closest that you're going to get to pinning down the first fume extraction systems in use, if you classify fumes as air inside the ship that you want to get rid of. Once steam and then obviously later on electric power was present on ships, then obviously the amount of smoke and etc. generated by the firing of guns in very enclosed spaces such as turrets would rapidly lead to the installation of various forms of fans and openings and hoods to try and get rid of that smoke, etc. When those innovations came about. So the capability was there from the start, and it was only when you had a very small ship or a bit of a rush job that you wouldn't have some kind of extraction system, or possibly one that was overwhelmed. But hopefully that gives some idea of the exact time period when you first saw the mechanical systems necessary. Andrew Miro asks, I don't know if you've seen the series The Last Ship, but they end it with ramming an Arleigh Burke class destroyer into an Iowa class battleship, which destroys the battleship. There's no way any modern destroyer could penetrate the kind of armour of a late era battleship like an Iowa or Vanguard, surely. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a weird one, I'll give you that, but to put it another way, having one of these things crash into you, if it's doing, say, about 30 knots, is about the equivalent of having a medium-sized airliner plough into you at an appreciable amount of its cruising speed. It's going to do a fair bit of damage, and these things are a bit more solid than airliners are, to put it mildly. Now, obviously, if you slam an Arleigh Burke sort of head-on into the broadside of a battleship with 12 plus inches of armour, the bow of the Arleigh Burke is going to come off a lot worse than the initial plating of the battleship, the armour plate, because, well, one is 12 inches plus thick, and the Arleigh Burke's bow definitely isn't. However, whilst ships are very solid, and even when you get something as substantial as HMS Camperdown ramming HMS Victoria, it was only the ram that punched through, the ship wasn't shorn clean in half. So an Arleigh Burke ramming full tilt into the side of an Iowa, I can see potentially resulting in the Iowa's sinking, but that would only be if, say, the underwater section of the Arleigh Burke's hull punched through and opened up a massive hole in the Iowa's underwater section. It's certainly not going to break the ship in half in and of itself. Yeah, I mean, it's not even so much a function of the armor plate itself, although obviously that is going to help smash in the face of anything that hits it. It might breach, it might buckle, it might bend, it might be torn off its mountings, whatever. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when you talk about an impact like this, the armor plate is only as good as the frames it's mounted on, which may well buckle or break under the force of the impact. But overall, a battleship's hull structure is going to be, that section is part of the ship is going to be well more than strong enough to withstand the impact without being cut in half. As I say, it might cause the ship to flood, roll over, and sink eventually, but that's probably about the worst case scenario. I mean, I've not seen the series, and on Amazon Prime, only up to season 4 is available for ready viewing, so I don't know if someone has got a screen cap of that, maybe send it to me so I can understand what's going on. I've only seen one very short clip, and that seems to imply that the target broke in half and sank amidships, and that's not realistic unless it was a second order effect like a magazine explosion. I Ship You Not asks a pair of questions. Firstly, he says, you've alluded to Bern basically being a waste of metal. What made her so terrible, and what could the French have done to make her useful? And secondly, under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, both France and Italy were granted 60,000 tons of displacement each to build aircraft carriers. Why didn't they actually push purpose-built carriers into service in the interwar-Second World War to Second World War period, and how might this have affected the war? So, with regards to the Bern, I'm going to cover that in the video that will eventually come out, which is the guide to the Bern. So, if possible, I'd kind of like to leave that to then. If you're not happy with that, let me know, and I'll make sure to answer it in next month's Patreon Q&A, in addition to whatever other question you've got for that particular month. Sorry, but I'd kind of want to keep that all in one place. Otherwise, it's going to be something that's answered multiple times. But in terms of the Washington Naval Treaty and why France and Italy didn't build carriers, part of it was they were both basically broke. They, as you can see, they didn't, even though they had a lot more room to play with when it came to their shipping compared to the major powers, they didn't actually build all that much in terms of major capital shipping until basically the early to mid 1930s, when the French started off with the Dunkirks. Now, the reason for that, I say, is mostly economic. They just couldn't afford to. And in both their cases, well, what did Italy need an aircraft carrier for? All of its imperial holdings, near enough as makes no difference, were in Africa, which was just over the Mediterranean. You don't need an aircraft carrier to do that. If you're Italy, you can just pop over. And therefore, the people who were likely to be for Italy to be fighting were going to be in the Mediterranean, and likewise, if you've got Italian bases in North Africa and Italy itself, you can cover most of the Mediterranean with aircraft. So there didn't seem to be much of a priority for that, even restricted budgets aside. And for the French, again, it was mostly restricted budgets. And then once the building race got going again, it was more about the capital ships. Now, obviously, they did plan to build some eventually, the Joffre class, but that never quite got off the ground before World War II intervened. But the other thing was that obviously France's main enemy that they were looking at potentially being was Germany. I mean, yes, fair enough, they pretty much disarmed it at Versailles, but they didn't quite trust the Germans, as it turned out, with good reason. And once Germany started rearming, they were mostly focused on that being the potential source of problems. And against a target like Germany that has a land border with you and not a very substantial navy, an aircraft carrier, again, is not particularly useful. But prior to that, when it was mostly just a competition with Italy, the French and the Italians actually had a semi-official truce of, if you don't build new warships, I won't build new warships, then we can both save money. Great. And by the time that came to an end, both sides were building capital ships, so they started to build capital ships in response to each other, which obviously weren't carriers. Now, that's why they didn't push to build purpose-built carriers. If they had, well, with the French, it kind of depends largely on the standard who, what, where, when, why. Are they building them in the 1920s? Are they building them in the 1930s? Maybe they just build the Joffres a little bit earlier. Who knows? If we say they build a relatively modern carrier in the two in the 1930s, then again, it's going to come down to where is that carrier at the time of the fall of France. If it's operating with British forces, so it might be in British home ports or in somewhere like Alexandria, then it may very well end up being disarmed, repurposed, handed over to the Free French, and be a relatively useful combatant going forward. If it's not ready, if it's not in those ports, if it's in Mers-El-Kebir or Dakar or somewhere else, Senegal, somewhere, one of the French, Vichy French ports, well, it's probably just going to stay where it is, isn't it? It's just going to be another victim of either something like Mers-El-Kebir or later attacks, or it's just going to end up being scuttled at Toulon. So yeah, location is going to affect that. And as for the Italian carriers, It might help the Italians somewhat in some of their battles with the Royal Navy, as they'd have on-point air support. But to be perfectly honest, the single biggest effective air attack on the Italians was at Taranto, and the carriers wouldn't have helped much with that. Perhaps maybe they would have helped with scouting, so a lot of the missed opportunities that the Italians had, if they had sort of a more rapid response time scouting aircraft that would be able to base off a carrier, that might have helped some of their naval engagements. And obviously it would have set up a number of possible air-to-air battles between British and Italian carrier aircraft during various of the fleet engagements, like the various battles of Sirte, etc. The 25th Dragoon asks, let's say someone with a time machine is forcing you to design a tri-hulled warship. You can choose from the First or Second World War for your target time period, and you have freedom to pick any country and ship type. Bonus points if you stick to historical dockyard sizes for the construction of your vessel. Okay. Okay, so if I'm forced to build a Triamaran warship, I'm going to have to go World War II for a start, because the technology is going to be an interesting proposition for the First World War. Apologies for the modern future concept picture, but as you might understand, coming up with a picture of a Triamaran battleship from World War II is a little bit of a long order. Anyway, if I was going to be forced to do it, in order to keep within the confines of existing dockyards, I wouldn't actually build the ship as a whole unit. What I would probably do is build 3 separate hulls, launch them separately, and then join them up together at the fitting out stage. So they'd have pre-sighted mounting sections for bolts and beams and girders and stuff, but that would all be done as part of the fit out stage with the help of a ship mounted crane, maybe from the central hull itself or maybe from elsewhere. Now, in terms of what I would do, I would probably take the approach of, well, let's put it this way. US battleships, Iowa, Montana kind of era, their approach was almost effectively, let's slap an Atlanta-class cruiser on the side and use that as our AA defense for in gun-wise. So how about we literally do this? Instead of metaphorically doing it, we build 2 Atlanta-class hulls, remove all the superstructure because you don't need command bridges and all that kind of silly nonsense when the Iowa class hull you've got in the middle is going to be your main command section. And since we're designing those fast carrier escorts, we know that they're all able to reach much for muchness in terms of speed. So you're going to have to keep the engines on board everyone, otherwise you're going to be slowed down. Although coordinating them is going to be interesting. Might have to include a few communications, cabling ducts in the cross pieces. Now, what I would then do when you've got your 2 superstructure-less Atlantas is abandon the stacked barbette system, because that's just going to get in the way, and mount them relatively far back to clear the forward part of the Iowa superstructure in terms of lines of fire. And then basically what I would do is I would mount just a long line of 5-inch 38 twin mounts along the aft and central portion of the Atlanta's hull, leave the forward part covered with 40mm Bofors gun nests to again give some fire for the amidships portion of the Iowa. Now, the only problem there you're going to have there is blast effects from the aft turret firing, but hey, you said I had to build this thing. There are certain limitations, so maybe the gun turret or the rear turret's only going to be able to fire at higher elevations, but this is why the middle and aft sections of the Atlanta are going to be using purely enclosed 5-inch 38 mounts rather than anything open, because nothing's really going to survive that at that point. And yeah, just go to town. So at that point, you've now got an Atlanta's worth of guns on each side of the Iowa, plus a bunch of 40mm nests, so you just got a massive additional anti-aircraft battery. That's about the closest I could come up with. And yeah, they just have to bolt the whole lot together, put some decking over it, have a nice place to muster the crew, etc. But short of inventing some kind of decoupling mechanism for combat, I can't see anything else really working. You might have to armor the insides of the Atlanta up a bit to withstand the gun blast as well, but say it's not a perfect solution. On a gun-based ship, a Triamaran hull of this kind is not really very useful at all. But there you go. Where you might have some small margin for possibility would be in some kind of Trimaran sloop or destroyer escort, where you could use the greater surface area of decking provided to install more depth charge launchers and light and medium anti-aircraft weaponry for convoy escort. That in and of itself might well work. But I have no idea how you'd even begin to design something of that scale as a Trimaran unit. Ali Arthur asks, well, actually a 5-paragraph question that effectively amounts to: what was the psychological state that British sailors were in after the Battle of Jutland, and was there an equivalent to shell shock that soldiers in the trenches suffered from? So this is a very complex question, and I can't possibly hope to answer it comprehensively, even if I took up the entirety of this Drydock's runtime. But I'll try to give some highlights from the research that I've done. Now, obviously, being involved in a battle like Jutland can have all sorts of effects, and as with men on the front lines in the trenches, what one man experiences and takes away from a situation may be completely different from what the man next to him experiences. And in his question, he references things like people on the Forth Bridge throwing things at some of the returning crew because they thought the Navy had run away. And that was a thing that happened. That was in large part due to the fact that when the High Seas Fleet got home, they immediately declared it a massive triumph and boasted that they'd sunk ridiculous numbers of Royal Navy ships, whilst the Admiralty, for better or worse, was waiting for everybody to get back in, compiling the reports, and then wanted to send out a picture that was collated from the reports of everybody. So they were being professional about it, but in a war that involved as much PR as actual shell fire, the Germans definitely got the one up on them in that regard. And as a result, obviously, a lot of people who'd heard the reports that Germany was putting out about the battle and seeing ships coming in dribs and drabs took the opinion that the Germans must have been right and the Royal Navy had been scattered to the four winds, when in fact what they were seeing in that particular case was some of the more damaged ships, in that particular instance the Warspite, that had been sent ahead of the Grand Fleet back to port, whilst the bulk of the British forces were obviously still either chasing after the Germans or proceeding in a single formation back to port. Now, that is recorded as having an effect on the morale of the crew. A couple of the accounts from people who were aboard Warspite at the time said that initially they were very confused, and they were also somewhat angry with one of the survivors. One of the crew even suggesting that he'd like to have a pop at them with one of the deck guns on the Warspite because he felt it was completely unjustified and a very bad way to treat them after everything they'd been through. And I suppose the sort of post-combat stress anger reaction is fairly understandable given the absolute battering the Warspite had been through, and it did have a bit of a depressing effect on the morale of the crew, because when they arrived they found that everyone thought the Royal Navy had been defeated, that Warspite was only there because it had run away, etc., etc. Whereas from their perspective, and this is the interesting thing, the majority of the crews on the ships in the Grand Fleet actually were pretty confident that they'd come away by far the better from that engagement, because there had been a number of German ships that had been heavily hit with a number of rather spectacular fires, and although that hadn't put the German ships down, from a distance the level of fire and smoke appeared to be similar to that from, say, Indefatigable or Queen Mary going up, and so a lot of the crewmen aboard the Grand Fleet had the distinct opinion that a significant number of German ships had in fact gone down. And this is reflected even as far as the Admiralty dispatches from Jutland, which are over 1,000 pages worth of documentation. If you ever fancy reading through them, I'm quite happy to provide a link for people to download it. But yeah, even as far as the official Admiralty reports a year or two later, they were even the relatively conservative overall assessment was that they thought they'd sunk at least half a dozen German capital ships. But anyway, so the Grand Fleet crew, they came back in relatively good spirits, all told, and there was this vast contrast with everyone thinking that they'd lost and legged it. But circling it back round to the effects on particular crewmen, it varied massively. As I say, so some people, they'd been through a very loud, frightening experience, but were otherwise unharmed, and so it was sort of just a combat stress deflation period. For many people, for the majority of the people in the Grand Fleet, it was actually not particularly anything dramatic. I mean, if you imagine if you're in the engine crews or the magazine and shell rooms of the vast majority of ships in the Grand Fleet, it would have been just like any other day at work. Yeah, you would have heard the occasional thrum and crump of explosions overhead, which might have been slightly nerve-wracking, but as far as you're concerned, apart from that, nothing else really is happening. You're aware that you're in battle, but that's really about it. Now, contrast that to, say, somebody on the bridge or somebody in one of the guns, whether that's the main guns or the secondary guns, that's probably a very different experience. And then if you're on something like, say, the Iron Duke, which gets a bunch of hits in and sees a bunch of enemy ships go up in flames, but doesn't get hit itself, again, you're probably feeling quite happy and confident about it, because everything you've thought about you being a superior sailor and in a superior navy appears to have been validated. Whereas if you're aboard, say, Malaya or Barham, or some of the destroyers and cruisers like the Chester that got badly shot up, there's going to be a number of cases of sort of what was termed shell shock, what we might call PTSD or whatever, because that's a very, very different experience when you've got people being blown up around you, everything's on fire, fragments going around, maybe some uncertainty as to whether or not your ship's going to survive. And then you've got the very few survivors from things like Queen Mary, Indefatigable, Invincible, Defence, etc., that have been blown up. They're going to have gone through an entirely different experience again. And on top of that, you've also got ships that were damaged but not particularly heavily damaged. I mean, you've got something like, say, Marlborough takes a torpedo hit amidships and eventually has to retire from the line. Colossus takes one 12-inch shell hit. But those ships stay in action. They keep fighting for quite a while, so you're probably quite proud of the fact that your ship has battle scars, and again, you probably think you've come out of it pretty well. So yeah, overall, the various accounts of the crews that I've read seem to indicate that most of them came away from Jutland in fairly high spirits and were a bit confused and put out by the overall semi-defeatist attitude they seemed to encounter when they got back. Although things did change around as the Admiralty began to release press reports, although obviously, as it turned out, both German and British press reports in the aftermath of Jutland were wildly inaccurate. But there were certainly some elements that of crews that were somewhat depressed or had psychological issues as a result, understandably, mostly when it came to survivors or ships that had been quite heavily damaged. But this is the thing with the industrial scale of Jutland, was that you could have, even on a single ship, you could have some men, again, who were, like, say, on Malaya, people on the secondary battery casemates who'd seen their friends burned alive and had to fight the fires and hope that the ship wouldn't explode. The effects on their psychology are going to be completely different to somebody in even something as close by as Malaya's main gun turrets, which weren't really much troubled, which again is going to be different to somebody who was in Malaya's engine room, who probably didn't know anything about what was going on, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very complex picture, and So you can't really sum up a psychological state of British sailors. Much the same as I suspect you can't sum up a psychological state of German sailors after a battle of that magnitude. It's going to be specific cases to specific ships and even specific parts of the ship. But there definitely was an equivalent of shell shock for some of those who were the worst affected. The other thing, of course, to bear in mind is that with a battle like Jutland, once it's over, you've got a day, anything between a day and 3 days of sailing with your friends, or at least those of them that survived in some cases, where you can sort of decompress, try and work out what was going on. You've got a lot of other people who were there with you who can share accounts. So it's a kind of a very almost a regimented form of psychological support, at least as far as the social niceties of the period allowed for, which meant that by the time the Grand Fleet arrived back in British ports, a lot of the sailors would have had a time to adjust and come to terms with some of what they'd experienced, as opposed to, say, someone in the trenches who might just be pulled off the line and within a couple of hours might be completely bereft of the organisation that they've known for the past few months or years. And similarly, for all the terribleness that was parts of the Battle of Jutland, it was done and over in under a day, whereas somebody on the front lines might be subject to a similar level of explosive bombardment for weeks, if not months at a time. And so the psychological profiles are also going to be very different there as well. Lewis Maskell asks, the naval battle in the 1959 Ben-Hur, what is fantasy and what has some basis in historic reality? This is actually, well, it's a very weird mix of both actually fairly realistic tactics and also some fantasy stuff. So the hilariously tiny catapults that they have are obviously quite fantasy. And yeah, the fireballs that seem to go off in random directions and can apparently travel about half the length of a ship are also obviously quite unrealistic. The use of ballistas, as we've mentioned earlier in the video with regards to another question, that's not necessarily out of the question. Roman legionaries as archers, probably not really a thing either. And the sheer number of ship-mounted artillery that's portrayed on aboard any given ship is also unrealistic. I mean, it's the average heavy warship, as we're supposed to believe the consul ship is probably at most would have maybe either 4 ballista or 2 ballista and a catapult, something in that region. And as I said, the catapult would be much bigger. The idea that there'd be so much fire and flaming shot aboard a wooden warship and aboard so many different wooden warships that's definitely a fantasy element. That's just asking for your whole fleet to go up in flames before you've even got to the battle. Although fire pots and such, as we've said, were in use, so having fire of some description aboard for use as ammunition is not out of the question, but they can completely over-egg it with the. I think that there's more projectiles flying around than there would be in some Age of Sail naval battles. But those are the more fantastical elements. But even then, as I say, they're elements that did exist at the time, just taken to the nth degree, as movies want to do. The ramming, however, is actually done pretty realistically. So a broadside ram, as you see later on in the battle, is both the consul ship and what is done to the consul ship. That's pretty much textbook ideal circumstances for a warship of the time. And the manoeuvre they pull off slightly earlier, where they try and scrape down the side of a ship, pull in their oars, and rip off all the opponent's oars, that also is classic ancient naval battle tactics 101. That was a very common manoeuvre because, for obvious reasons, you don't want to go head-to-head with somebody because you both got rams. That's just going to end badly. Going in a stern chase is a good way to wear out your rowers. So ideally, you want that broadside ram. But obviously, everybody has a vested interest in not being rammed broadside on, and they'll use their oarsmen to manoeuvre the ship to avoid that. So this kind of take out all the oars on one side of the ship, thus crippling it and leaving it open to be rammed, or in later Roman cases boarded, that is definitely a thing that was done at the time, and we have historical accounts that talk about that. So yeah, overall, it's got a number of maneuvers that are very definitely from ancient sea warfare, and the other elements are, apart from maybe the massed ranks of legionary archers, other than that, the elements that are a bit more fantastical are still somewhat rooted in reality, just taken up and turned up to 11. Bearpaw asks, have you seen Zippang, which is apparently an anime about a modern Japanese destroyer that gets teleported to just after the Battle of Midway, and how would you advise the 1942 USN-RN to defeat a modern guided missile destroyer? So first question, no, I have not seen that anime. I think I may have seen a clip or two of it, but no, I haven't seen the anime itself. Now, in terms of advising 1942 era Navy to defeat a modern guided missile destroyer, well, again, this ventures into the realms of modern shipping, so this is not my particular area of expertise, but in broad terms, I'd say, well, one, define a guided missile destroyer, because you could be talking about anything from a ship with a few dozen surface-to-air missiles, and if you're lucky, maybe a couple of boxes of harpoons or exocets, all the way over to something like one of the Russian ships with their let's fire a couple of school buses weight of gigantic supersonic cruise missiles and see what fragments are left afterwards. So the tactics are going to vary massively depending on exactly what it is you're up against. But assuming you're up against your average generic Western style, primarily anti-aircraft warfare destroyer, I think the main tactic would be to come after it with a fast battleship, because a fast battleship is likely to be able to either keep up or at least keep track of a guided missile destroyer. Again, it depends on the destroyer. Some modern destroyers are faster than others, but something like definitely an Iowa, but even some of the sort of the other fast ones like a Bismarck. Well, Bismarck's not Royal Navy or USN, but let's say an Iowa or Vanguard or something like that. Vanguard's not around at 42, so yeah, we take South Dakota and Iowa or King George V, or maybe some of the heavy cruisers, like a County or something, and run them down, because the modern destroyers, yes, they've got a radar guided 4.5, 5-inch gun, depending on the destroyer. So you don't want to send your destroyers after them, because rapid fire radar guided deck gun, and in some cases if they're using standard missiles with a surface attack mode, those will do quite the number on any reasonable number of destroyers you send after it. But something along the lines of a heavy cruiser or a battleship is going to have the damage tanking potential to just absorb that. I mean, sure, you can take out the main fire control system or something, but your deck gun's not going to be able to scratch the gun turrets, which have their own local fire control system, or the belt armor on battleships. So yeah, you'll be able to wreck the superstructure and set a bunch of fires and such like, but the actual combat fighting capability of the main battery is not going to be all that much changed, and depending on some ships that have the more armoured secondary batteries, maybe even the secondary battery might not be too badly affected. And again, with the sort of, yes, you have some surface-to-air missiles that have a attack, sort of a surface attack capability, but they're nowhere near as effective in that role as dedicated surface-to-surface missiles. Now, again, you might have exocets and harpoons and what have you, but I'm relatively sure something the size of a treaty or post-treaty battleship can tank a few of those kinds of missiles and come out trucking anyway. But again, it depends on the capabilities of the destroyer in question. But yes, so basically come after it with a big capital ship that's got a lot of damage absorption potential and armoured gun batteries, because eventually you'll run it down. And modern guided missile destroyers aren't going to stand up to 14, 15 or 16-inch gunfire very well. I wouldn't send in air attack, because again, air attack is just kind of, well, you're asking for the similar thing to happen as would happen to your destroyers, and submarines are just even more of a joke. So about the best an air attack could hope to be would be a distraction to force them to fire surface-to-air missiles and CIWS systems at the aircraft, which would then mean that it's only a deck gun and maybe some surface-to-surface missiles against your capital ship. But realistically speaking, you'd have to define what the modern guided missile destroyer was in the first place. Because I say, if it's one of the Russians with their gigantic anti-shipping missiles stuck on it, it's just a case of, well, how many ships do you want to lose before they run out of ammunition? Aaron Davis asks, battle cruisers are famous for sacrificing armour for speed and firepower, and battleships, pre the fast battleship era, more or less trade off speed for firepower and armour. Were there any noteworthy experiments that traded firepower for exceptional armour? I'm thinking of ships that made the trade-off to a much greater degree than, say, the High Seas Fleet's dreadnoughts. To be honest, some of the German World War I designs are probably about the closest you're going to find in the 1900s through to the 1940s, where you trade off firepower for additional armour. I mean, the next closest one you'd probably find would maybe be the King George V class, where they had very thick armour, especially for a treaty battleship, but quote-unquote only 14-inch guns, albeit that was in large part due to treaty restrictions on gun caliber more than anything else. So yeah, some of the German ships, especially some of their later 11-inch battle cruiser designs and a few of the later 12-inch battleships, had very thick armour for their type of ship and for the era, and they paid for that with decreased firepower relative to their immediate competitors. I mean, outside of that, in the dreadnought era, generally, at least until Yamato, the Japanese tended to go for speed and firepower over armour. The British tended to emphasise the firepower first and then speed and armour kind of second. The US went a little bit more for the armour. Sort of armour, then firepower, then speed. The Italians tended to like the speed and the firepower over the armour. The French were a little bit all over the shop throughout the period. I mean, some of their ships were relatively well armoured, some of their ships were relatively well armed. And then you have weird things like Dunkirk and Strasbourg, where Dunkirk is actually pretty badly armoured, but Strasbourg is not too badly armoured for its role, even though they're ostensibly the same class. I think if you want to look for the absolute sort of wild cards beyond the level of balance that the High Seas Fleet dreadnoughts went for, you probably have to go back 20, 30 years to the sort of experimental period of ironclad, sort of 1870s through to the mid 1880s, something like that, because that's when you get things like, say, Re d'Italia with its maximum firepower, no armour approach, and there are a few ships from that period that go for the maximum armour and will get by with what firepower we have approach. Generally, where you tend to see the ships that go really wild on the all armour, relatively small firepower, is in the early part of that period, maybe the late 1860s, early 1870s, when there's still a lot of wooden warships around, and maybe a lot of smaller navies that don't necessarily have the resources to afford a whole fleet of ironclads, but they might afford one or two relatively powerful ironclads, and so they'll sort of ramp up the armour on those to make sure there's virtually no chance they might lose their investment. But they don't have to go for massive firepower because they know that most of their opponents are going to be wooden ships, and so ridiculous levels of firepower aren't necessarily needed to take those out. So you might think of something like the Huascar, the ironclad that was operated by both Peru and Chile, as that vessel, at least until bigger and better guns came along, was pretty much invulnerable to anything that got thrown at it, but its firepower wasn't anything particularly to write home about. Federico Bozzi asks, could you rate World War II heavy torpedoes, including the US Mark 14 after refit, and why wasn't the Long Lance used in submarines? Now, the interesting thing with this question is, how do you define what a heavy torpedo is? Because almost universally, you had an 18-inch torpedo or thereabouts that was used by airborne torpedo bombers, and then you had the 21-inch torpedo that was used by submarines and surface shipping. And that's basically plus or minus a few millimeters here and there. Effectively describes almost every torpedo in use in World War II. If you want to have a heavy torpedo classification, you're either talking about 21-inch torpedoes and up, in which case that's going to have to be its own special video because there are so many, or alternatively, you talk about torpedoes that are greater than 21-inch diameter, at which point there's only two to discuss, which is the Long Lance, the Type 93 Long Lance, which is a 24-inch torpedo, and the slightly larger than that torpedo that was used in the Nelson class and pretty much nowhere else, the 24.5-inch torpedo. That and those would be quote unquote the heavy torpedoes. So, as I say, for sake of obviously keeping the 21-inch torpedo comparison to a separate video for time reasons, if you compare the Long Lance and the 24.5-inch Mark 1 on the Nelson class, it's a fairly easy one. The Long Lance has significantly greater range. Its explosive charge is either just under or well over half a ton, which is quite considerable compared to the. I mean, the 24.5 inch is not terrible at about a third of a ton of TNT, but it doesn't hold a candle to the Long Lance. And to say the Long Lance is significantly longer ranged as well, which is to be expected given that the Long Lance is a considerably longer weapon as on top of things. Now, as far as why the Long Lance wasn't used in submarines, this basically comes back to the previous point, which is it's a 24-inch torpedo. It's huge, and the submarines just weren't equipped for firing that. What they did do was they made the Type 95 torpedo, which was a derivative of the Long Lance. And that was a 21-inch torpedo that then could be fitted into submarines and was used. Indeed, though a spread of Type 95s were almost certainly the torpedoes that killed the Wasp, damaged the North Carolina, and sank the O'Brien. So they're not to be written off just because they happen to be slightly smaller. And as a result, this is why in sort of common parlance, the submarines are quite often described as firing quote-unquote Long Lance torpedoes, and indeed I referenced that in the USS Wasp video. And as I say, that's purely because they are basically slightly downscaled Type 93 Long Lances. They aren't the Long Lance, they aren't the Type 93 torpedo, but they're effectively that in a 3-inch narrower package. Memori asks, for the famous signal Nelson flew before the Battle of Trafalgar was joined, how was it conveyed quickly and clearly to the rest of the fleet, as a lot of flags were used, but the fleet was still able to repeat it throughout the formation with all the limitations and observation, before engage the enemy more closely was flown and kept aloft for the rest of battle? Were there any other signals, aside from Togo's, along the same idea flown by other navies before battle, or just some fun signals sent in general? This actually brings up an interesting point when it comes to Age of Sail battle tactics, because it was acknowledged that when you've got everybody into a line of battle and there's sails and whatnot all in the way, it's pretty difficult to actually see a string of flags flying from your flagship, especially since its own sails might well be getting in the way, unless you're looking at it from a side-on angle, in which case, why aren't you in the line of battle? But this is where frigates come in. So if you look at the order of battle for Trafalgar, you'll notice that both sides had a few frigates around, such as this one, HMS Euryalus, which was present. These frigates, as well as having a post-battle role in towing some of the more damaged first rates and third rates to make sure they didn't go aground, but in the initial stages of the battle, these were actually signal repeating ships as well. So because they were off to one side of the battle line, when the Admiral hoisted a series of flag orders, then a frigate such as the Euryalus would hoist the matching flags, and then everybody in the line of battle could look to one side and see the Euryalus broadside on and go, oh, right, okay, that's what the Admiral is saying. Cool. So they didn't have to repeat the signal all the way down the line. And this was helped by the fact that Age of Sail battles tended to be a lot more close quarters than modern battles or even World War I, World War II battles. And so with all the ships in a battle line, they might occupy only a couple of miles, which would mean that a well-positioned frigate would be able to repeat the signal to the entire line formation without much of a problem. So, for example, at the Battle of Trafalgar, once Victory had hoisted that signal, then potentially as few as 3 other ships would have needed to hoist the signal for everybody to see it. So Victory would have hoisted it, Euryalus would have hoisted it, then everyone in Victory's line would have known, and then either Royal Sovereign or a repeater frigate between the two lines would have hoisted it, and then a repeater frigate on the other side of the Royal Sovereign's line would have hoisted the signal, and then everyone in Royal Sovereign's line would also have known, assuming they didn't just read it straight off of Victory. In terms of similar signals, Napoleon ordered a French equivalent to be flown in French ships thereafter. I don't know if that still holds, but it at least did for a time. There were, of course, the various signals flown by both sides during the War of 1812, albeit they tended to abandon the formal flag signalling procedure and just print or paint massive sentences on gigantic flags that they then hang from the highest mast on the ship. Some of those, obviously, the sort of trolling wars between President and between Essex and the 2 ships that it fought were quite legendary at the time. And now, obviously, flag signalling requires a fair bit of time, and so those signals tend to be quite, should we say, quite formal, or otherwise generally prepared in advance, as per, say, Togo's signal. But once the telegraph and then later the full-on radio got going, there were quite a number of amusing signals sent back and forth between ships in various navies. And for this purpose, I would recommend a book called Make Another Signal, which is on my amusing shelf, as this contains quite a lot of different amusing messages sent between various Royal Navy ships, and I'm sure a number of you can chime in with funny or otherwise amusing signals sent by ships in your own navies, but I have this book, so I'm going to ruthlessly steal a couple of quotes from there. So, signal from an admiral when a bombardment by a battle squadron knocked down, accidentally demolished a local landmark. Who knocked that lighthouse down, and why? Between 2 small escort ships, once they received news in late 1941 that Japan was now at war with the British Empire. Commence hostilities with Japan. Reply, permission to finish breakfast first? One particular one from a slightly lost ship in the aftermath of Jutland. Join me! Where am I? One particular confused jumble of flags that was being flown from a trawler prompted this signal from a destroyer. What is the significance of that signal you are flying? To which the trawler replied, regret, I don't know. The flags smelt of fish. And finally, this pretty much sums up the K-class submarines in their entirety. A supposed conversation between a junior officer at the aft end of a submarine and the commanding officer at the other end of the submarine during diving trials. I say, sir, my end is diving. What's your end doing? Colonel Cheng asks, could Zeppelins have been used to good effect for commerce protection in the Atlantic, especially as patrol aircraft, as with their long loiter times over target, excellent visibility and static and stable flight, surely they'd be a convoy's best friend at a World War II era submarine's worst nightmare. On a related note, could a FW-200 Condor have more than an even chance of defending itself from an attacking F-9C Sparrowhawk? So, yes, if they were still around by the time of World War II, Zeppelins and other rigid airships such as Akron and Macon could indeed have made relatively decent anti-submarine platforms for the World War II convoy period. And that's because for a good chunk of the early part of the war, there was what they called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, and this was gradually narrowed and eventually closed. But for a long time, U-boats knew that whilst Allied aircraft were obviously very dangerous off the British coast, and then after 1941 off the American coast, there was this huge part of the mid-Atlantic where the aircraft couldn't reach, and since escort carriers hadn't really gotten into full production yet, there wasn't any real airborne anti-surface coverage, anti-submarine warfare coverage, sorry. So, in that respect, yeah, a Zeppelin would have been a superb platform to have to close that gap, as for all the reasons you say. They'd be able to loiter above the convoy, they'd have a massive sort of long-range bird's eye view, and if you were using something like Akron or Macon or possibly even the even larger carriers Zeppelins that the Americans were planning on building, but didn't because of the disasters that affected those two airships, then they could even have dispatched small aircraft to go and attack the submarines. And that would have been the one weakness of just a Zeppelin in and of itself, in that its speed is not tremendously great. So they could spot U-boats and maybe direct people to them, but actually going after them themselves, okay, fair enough, they'd be faster than a ship, but a U-boat would still have plenty of time to see them coming. Whereas now, flying aircraft carriers, much as they were a technological dead end in overall terms, in this specific instance, if you could fit up some of the small aircraft with bombs or rockets or something of that nature, then they definitely could have been of use, albeit obviously they are vulnerable to storms and such, which is what did in for the two airships in the first place. Now, in terms of whether an FW-200 Condor has a decent chance of defending itself against a Sparrowhawk, yes, I'm afraid to say it does. The Sparrowhawk has a grand total of armament of 2 rifle caliber machine guns, which is not great. Also, the Condor has about 50 miles an hour on it in top speed, so worst comes to worst, the Condor can just fly away, and there's not a lot the Sparrowhawk can do about it. But even if the Condor deigns to stay around and fight out, the Condor has 5 or 6 machine guns and a cannon, and a couple of those machine guns are heavier. So, yeah, I wouldn't put my money on the Sparrowhawk at that point. Maybe 3 or 4 of them, but one Sparrowhawk against a Condor, I'm putting my money on the Condor walking away from that one. George Armatus asks, were any U-boats sunk by planes in World War I, and do you have any suggestions for books about the Victorian Royal Navy? So yes, there were a number of U-boats that were apparently sunk by aircraft in World War I. A few of them, to be fair, there are question marks over it. Sort of, the U-boat is agreed that it was lost, but whether it was the attack by an aircraft that sent it to the bottom, or whether it was damaged and later on sunk by something else. As I said, there's a lot of question marks over a number of them. There's definitely a bunch of confirmed kills where aircraft participated, both fixed wing and airships, participating in a kill along with surface warships, but there are also a few that are directly attributed to aircraft alone. The Russians apparently got at least one. Unsurprisingly, given the main target of the U-boats, the British reported to have taken down at least 3 or 4. Possibly more. So, yeah, it was much rarer than it was in World War II, but there definitely were U-boats that were sunk either in part or in total by aircraft during the First World War. Now, in terms of books about the Victorian Royal Navy, yeah, I've got quite a few recommendations on that score. See, the main thing with the Victorian Royal Navy is that it actually covers, well, effectively 4 periods. So it's very unlikely that you'll find a book that covers the entirety of that period in anything like sufficient detail, because you've got effectively the tail end of the Age of Sail, and then you've got the steam wooden warships era, then you have the ironclad era, and then at the end of that you have the pre-dreadnought effectively era, going into the 20th century. So there are books that cover all of those, but in various specific parts. So the ones that I would recommend would be there's Battleships in Transition by Andrew Lambert, which is one of the few books that covers the basically sail into steam and thence into the first ironclads period, which is not a subject that's particularly heavily covered. But it is an excellent summary of that particular situation. Then you've got The Black Battle Fleet by Admiral Ballard, which covers the ironclad era very well. Then you've also got British Battleships of the Victorian Era by Norman Friedman, which is an excellent resource. If you can find a copy, you've got British Battleships by Dr. Oscar Parkes, which again covers the ironclad era, goes well, that's actually British Battleships 1860 to 1950, but that contains an excellent summary of basically warrior onwards as far as battleships are concerned. And there's also a book called Before the Battle Cruiser that looks at a number of the large cruisers built in the latter part of the Victorian period. Norman Friedman's also done a book on British cruisers of the Victorian era, definitely also well worth a read. And that generally covers sort of the battleships and cruisers part of the fleet. If you want to learn about some of the smaller stuff, gunboats and stuff, I can also give a list of recommendations for that. Pete Agrabright asks, after watching the new Midway movie, I had one question in particular. How much was civilian transport by ship affected during the two world wars? I would imagine trips between Hawaii and the mainland US were still common, but what about transport from the US to, say, Australia or the UK? Were they virtually non-existent, or were they integrated into convoy systems? Being that they weren't essential to the war effort, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were not integrated and forced to fend for themselves or barred from travel entirely. So, civilian passenger numbers took a massive downturn during the Second World War, as a vast number of steam liners and other similar civilian merchant craft designed for carrying passengers were either donated or seized by the various governments, including the US, for use as general transports, troop transports, etc., etc. Some armed merchant cruisers in the UK and other similar uses, anti-aircraft vessels, whatever. Plus, of course, there was the additional danger for the remaining civilian passenger ships of travelling through areas infested by merchant raiders and submarines. So where they could, they would try and pick up convoys, but at the same time, passenger liners generally ran faster, and if they were running privately, they had money to make. So sometimes they'd sail in small groups, sometimes they'd sail on their own. I say sometimes they'd sail with fast convoys if they could, but there weren't that many of them compared to the pre-war liner market, and as a result, some of them did suffer from being caught out and sunk by various means, submarines, raiders, aircraft, etc. Long distance in towards active war zones was very difficult. I mean, you'd struggle to find people who would travel on a ship that was sailing alone through the North Atlantic, if they could at all avoid it, although it was done. So yeah, it happened, but it was much, much rarer, and where possible, they'd try and get in on a fast convoy. Michael Jones asks, what is your opinion on the conversion of the Hawkins class from 7.5-inch to 6-inch cruisers? Was Effingham, before it sank, a more useful ship post-conversion than the unconverted Hawkins? So the conversion process that was done was planned for the other surviving Hawkins class, but never completed due to wartime. And, well, it made the best of an old hull. The original armament of 7.5-inch guns by the time of World War II was not especially useful, as that put it into the category of heavy cruiser in terms of rate of fire, but broadside, it had even lesser broadside than something like an Exeter or York, with less range and much more vulnerable gun mountings. So not a particularly useful unit. Whereas, although the 6-inch guns weren't the newest, they had a similar range to the 7.5-inch guns. They had a much greater rate of fire, and given that the shells were half the weight, they were much easier to handle, given that they were all on single open mounts. So, well, semi-protected mounts, but whatever. But they generally the 6-inch guns were a lot more useful, and of course, with there being 9 of them and having a greater broadside, it did bring its firepower up to the level of at least a small light cruiser. So that's not too terrible. So yes, overall, it would have been a much more useful vessel, especially since the weight savings as a result of the conversion allowed for it to have a semi-decent anti-aircraft battery, at least for the early part of the war. So yes, Effingham, prior to its loss, would have been a much more useful vessel than the other Hawkins class, in that it could reasonably hold its own against some of the smaller enemy ships around, so light cruisers, large destroyers, etc., which puts it quite nicely into a useful niche, where comparable to something like a Leander class. Whereas if you look at something like the original unconverted Hawkins, it's difficult to find a niche for it to actually fit into in World War II. Colonel Overkill asks, I've seen some Soviet rivercraft armed with Katyushka rockets or various models of tank turret, and even the USS Barb submarine had a brace of rockets for shore bombardment. In that spirit, what are some of the oddest armed or outfitted warships that you can think of? Liberty ships full of tanks don't count. Well, in that latter respect, there was actually a ship that decided to use those tanks. During the scattering of convoy PQ-17, one of the ships fetched up in the ice of the Arctic and decided to wait out any potential German raiders, but just in case, they not only disguised themselves as an iceberg, they actually brought tanks up from the hold onto the deck and cleared them out and got them ready to fire. So if anybody had shown up to attack that ship, they would have been on the rather bemused receiving end of a bunch of 75mm gunfire from Shermans, which would have been quite the fascinating duel. But anyway, in terms of odd armament and outfitting, you really have to go looking at the smaller warships, because the larger warships all tend to follow much of a similar pattern, outside of maybe things like the unguided rocket projectiles of the British Navy. But when you get down into the realms of monitors and small attack craft, all sorts of weird and wonderful things could be found, particularly the motor torpedo boats, motor gun boats, PT boats, etc. The Germans generally were very organised about this, unsurprisingly, and had fairly regimented sections of weapons. You might find different numbers of those weapons, but generally it would be sort of 20mm, 37mm cannon, etc. British motor gun boats could sometimes be distinguished by the fact they'd have a very eclectic mix, so rifle caliber, heavy caliber machine guns, 20mm cannons, 2-pounders, 40mm Bofors, 6-pounders, and other weapons could all be found sometimes on the same motor gunboat. But if you really want to see really truly bizarre odd weapons fits, you have to look at the PT boats of the US Navy, because for some vaguely inexplicable reason, the PT boats were the only class of US Navy ship that were built and sent into service severely underarmed. They had torpedo launchers of varying questionable levels of effectiveness, but beyond that, most of them were sent to the front line, initially at least, with just a couple of 50 cals, which, given the armament of, well, basically every other Navy's small craft divisions, is a truly pitiful armament. And you're giving these things to Americans? I don't think this situation is going to stand for very long. So within a case of a few months, you had PT boats that were sporting anything from the following range of weapons. Aircraft cannons, heavy machine guns, light machine guns, rocket launchers, bazookas. I don't know where they found those, but apparently one or two of them did. Um, Aircraft cannons, as we said, mortars, flare launchers, 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors. A few Chicago pianos were spotted on occasion. Anti-tank guns, and some of the PT boats would take multiple of those options. So during the quick bit of reading that I did for this question, I discovered that one PT boat was dispatched with a pair of torpedo tubes and, well, torpedoes, and a pair of 50 cal machine guns, and about a year and a half after being in service, it was found to be mounting 2 light mortars, an anti-tank gun, a cannon, a rapid-fire cannon, and about 6 machine guns of different calibers, plus if anybody on board the ship, or board the boat rather, didn't have a gun at that point, there were also a couple of braces of Tommy guns and a few rifles, just in case you wanted to add a little bit extra firepower into the mix. So yeah, effectively it was small boats, which tend to attract the more interesting types of crews in the first place, and they belong in the US Navy, and they're chronically underarmed, and they're put in a situation where they can beg, borrow, and steal a whole wide and interesting variety of small arms, and medium weaponry. So it's somewhat unsurprising that I think those boats definitely win the prize for most eclectic range of armaments. And finally, Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, do you think Admiral Cunningham might have or would have produced a better result had he, rather than Admiral Somerville, been at the helm at Mers-El-Kebir? And if not, did Admiral Cunningham have advantages that Admiral Somerville did not while he negotiated with the French Navy? It's a very difficult one to judge. Obviously, Admiral Cunningham's slightly more senior than Admiral Somerville, but at the same time, Admiral Somerville really didn't want to fire on the French, and to a certain extent, his hand was forced both by London and by the fact that the French were sending reinforcements with a clear intent to fight back. And as we covered in the video on Mers-El-Kebir, a lot of it also comes down to both sides negotiating in good faith, and whilst Admiral Cunningham's negotiations with Admiral Godefroy in Alexandria went relatively well, albeit they were nearly upset by the events in Mers-El-Kebir, Godefroy was perhaps a little bit more reasonable than Gensoul, and they did manage to come to an accord, even though Cunningham went over the Admiralty set deadline. So, given the circumstances, it's possible Cunningham might have done it slightly better, but I think that'll probably be because, if anything, as a more senior officer, not only would Cunningham probably have merited turning up off of Mers-El-Kebir with a slightly larger, more powerful force, which might have then left him a little bit more confident, or perhaps a little less worried about the ships that the French were sending to Mers-El-Kebir, but also he probably would have had the seniority to play for time a bit longer. I mean, Admiral Gensoul was making a few concessions, so between Cunningham being a more senior officer, even if he didn't directly negotiate with him, and also the fact that, as I say, Cunningham might have been able to bend the rules a little bit and might have had a little bit of a larger force, it's possible that he might have been able to persuade Gensoul to do something other than what historically happened, but as I say, it takes two to make a successful negotiation. I think the best strategy Cunningham might have been able to play for, assuming that the negotiations in Alexandria and elsewhere went relatively well, even in his absence, would be possibly by just extending the timeline a little bit, and thus, if he could then bring word to Gensoul that the French ships in Alexandria and other British ports had agreed to either disarm or otherwise comply with the British terms, that might have tipped Jansel over into doing something that Cunningham could sail away from and call a victory, whether that would be temporarily immobilizing the fleet or sailing it off to the French held parts of the Caribbean. I don't know, but he might have been able to pull it off. I certainly wouldn't put money on it, but if there was anyone in the British fleet who might have been able to get Jansel to agree to something that didn't involve the British firing on the French, then Cunningham's probably the one who could have pulled it off. And so, 2 and a bit hours in, we are finally at the end of this first Q&A of 2020. So thank you very much for listening. I might have to find some other way of dealing with these Patreon questions, but more on that later. They still will be answered, there just might be a slightly different format or layout to it. But anyway, thank you very much for listening, and good luck to everybody in 2020, and let's see how we go from here.